As I explained in a community post, this does not mark an end to my Five Nights at Freddy's videos. If you come to my channel only for Five Nights at Freddy's content, then do not worry, as I still have plenty of video ideas for it in the future. Anyway, if you are still around, then let's begin this Transformers video. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Transformers is a franchise filled with hundreds upon hundreds of characters throughout its hundreds upon hundreds of continuities. Some characters, such as Optimus Prime, Megatron, and Starscream, are some of the most recognizable pieces of iconography associated with the brand, with multiple appearances in media and toy lines. Some characters, such as Blue Streak and Astro Train, are not quite as well known, but are still fan favorites and are frequently featured in new media and toy lines. However, there are some characters who are so obscure that most fans are unaware that they even exist. These characters often only make one or two media appearances, or have little to no presence in toy lines. Despite that, many of these characters still have interesting circumstances surrounding them. So, for my second Transformers video, I would like to cover 20 of the most obscure characters in the Transformers multiverse. I actually have plans to make videos explaining various Transformers characters, so this video will mainly consist of obscure characters who do not have enough history to justify their own videos. For example, characters like Tigatron and Shatter will not be featured in this video since, while they have very few appearances, they are definitely not obscure by any means. Also, I have decided that this list will not contain any characters who are based on color schemes from pre-Transformers toy lines, such as Diaclone and Microchange, since I have plans to make a video on them in the future. As you can imagine, this video went through several rewrites, meaning that several characters were planned to be featured in this video, but were ultimately removed, as a result of the two criteria mentioned above. These include: the characters featured in this video are not listed in any particular order, and the video is meant to be informative, rather than opinion-based, even though some opinions could be sprinkled across the video. With the introduction finished, let's begin with the first character. The first obscure character that I would like to mention is one of the newest Transformers characters, Lord Hammer. Before I discuss the character himself, I will first cover the background surrounding his recent creation. In 1998, the Japanese Beast Wars second toy line saw the release of the Space Pirate Seacons, Scylla, Terramander, Sea Lagan, Sea Phantom, and their leader Half-Shell, with the team merging into God Neptune. The team were echoes of the Generation 1 Seacons, released a decade prior in 1988. However, for unknown reasons, one of the original Seacons was omitted from the Beast Wars second release, and that was Nautilator, or Lobclaw, as he was known in Japan. For decades, the Space Pirate Seacons consisted only of these 5 members, even when they received modern updates in the Generations Selects toy line in 2020, of course being redecos of the updated Generation 1 Seacon figures. However, the Generations Selects special comic would actually add a 6th member to the team. This 6th member was, of course, Lord Hammer, a redeco of Nautilator in the grey and golden color scheme of the Space Pirate Seacons. Due to being a redeco of Nautilator, it is safe to assume that Lord Hammer transforms into a lobster. Unfortunately, we may never receive confirmation of this, since the future is looking quite bleak for this new character. In his debut manga, God Neptune Comic 4, the Seacons were betrayed by their former leader, Duncan, and left adrift in space, with their newest crew member, Lord Hammer, fatally injured. He was abruptly captured by a golden version of Starscream, in order to conscript the Space Pirate Seacons into the service of the Gold Warriors, as part of Primus's grand and convoluted plan. As of this video, this plot point has yet to be resolved, so Lord Hammer's fate remains uncertain. Next, we have the first two-way tie on this list, Sure Shot and Archforce. If you are confused as to why I am displaying the Generation 2 hero versions of Optimus Prime and Megatron, Then let me explain. Around the release of Generation 2, Hasbro's European offices apparently did not want an oversaturation of Optimus Prime and Megatron toys on their shelves. Presumably, this was only enforced during the 1990s, since no Optimus Prime and Megatron toys have been renamed for their European releases since. As a result of this mandate, when the hero versions of Optimus Prime and Megatron were released in European markets in 1994, any decals that bore their names were either heavily altered or removed, and the figures were even renamed. Optimus was renamed Sure Shot, not to be confused with the Generation 1 Target Master, while Megatron was renamed Archforce. Sure Shot transformed into a long-nosed Kenworth truck, while Archforce transformed into an Abrams M1A1 assault tank. The toys' bios were reworded to include these new names, with them basically sharing the same personalities as Optimus and Megatron, though the high-tech spec stats were removed entirely. Unfortunately, these characters' appearances in media have been limited to mentions by Ask Vector Prime, a question and answer column. Archforce received a more significant appearance when, in 2015, he was retconned by Ask Vector Prime to be the Decepticon trooper who was rebuilt by Straxus into a Megatron clone in the Marvel UK comics. On the other hand, Sure Shot's only appearance has been the revelation that he suffers from Primus apotheosis, a Cybertronian personality disorder that causes sufferers to obsessively worship Optimus Prime, which was first displayed in the 2005 IDW continuity with the Autobot Rekka Pyro. Perhaps, if new versions of Heroes Optimus Prime and Megatron are released in the future, they could be sold as Sure Shot and Archforce, as a homage to this bizarre case of repurposing. The next obscure character on this list is Septimus Prime. If you are unfamiliar with Phase 2 of the IDW comics, then you may be confused by the existence of a 14th Prime, when there are usually only 13 in the IDW continuity. Rather than divine creations of Primus, the Primes were instead charismatic tribal leaders from Cybertronian prehistory, meaning that more than 13 could exist at once. However, the only extra Prime to be depicted on panel was Septimus Prime, the ruler of Proto-Hex, only appearing in a flashback in issue 10 of Optimus Prime, Origin Myths. Septimus was depicted as a tyrannical ruler, who forced gladiators to fight to the death for Energon. However, his rule came to an end during a forced match between the twins Arcee and Galvatron, when Megatronus slew his entourage, declared his intention to absorb Proto-Hex into the Darklands, and threw Septimus into the ring to be executed by the twin gladiators. Septimus Prime would later be forgotten by history, with Onyx Prime, who was actually a time-traveling Shockwave in disguise, claiming that he was never a true Prime. Unfortunately, Septimus Prime seems unlikely to be used again in future Transformers stories, since it is unknown if the IDW approach to the Primes will be used again. However, Septimus could also be depicted as one of the many false Primes to have existed in between the 13 and Optimus Prime. The next obscure character on this list is Death Cobra. Death Cobra was created for the Transformers Victory anime. His only appearance was the episode Unite, Lio Kaiser, where he was depicted as a stern, professional member of the Decepticon Chest Force, who threatened to take the place of the cowardly, untrustworthy Hellbat. When Death Cobra was unmoved by Hellbat's request for him to leave, a firefight between them led to his accidental demise.
あれは物の弾みだ。貴様というやつはやめてくれ、やめてくれ。急所に当たっちゃった。
And resulted in Hellbat being able to join the team's formation into Lio Kaiser. Ironically, Death Cobra's role in the series was so short-lived that he never received a transformation sequence into either his robot mode or his Hind Mi-24 assault helicopter alternate mode, or a weapon/chest plate sequence, for his breast animal Cobra breast, two events that are very frequently repeated for each character in Victory. Due to his extremely brief role and lack of representation in the Victory toy line, Death Cobra has been largely forgotten, outside of a brief cameo as a member of Deathsaurus's Decepticons in issue 39 of More Than Meets the Eye, The Permanent Revolution. Concerning other continuities, a heroic version of him made a brief cameo in the Shattered Glass story Reunification. This next obscure character, Karzap, actually originates from a previously cancelled toy line. Following Generation 2, Takara had plans to launch a new toy line known as Blocktown, which would merge Transformers with Kawada's Diablock toy line, which was a Japanese Lego competitor. One of the planned playsets was the Garage set, which would have come with the Autobot Karzap Deco of Generation 2 Windbreaker, who transformed into a Chevrolet Camaro Z28. However, possibly due to the launch of Beast Wars in 1996, Blocktown was eventually cancelled, meaning that Karzap's planned toy was never released. However, in 2015, Karzap would receive his first officially released figure, as part of Fun Publications' Transformers figure subscription service 3.0. The figure was a redeco of Generation's thrilling 30 Bumblebee, who transformed into a 5th generation Ford Mustang, but retooled with a new head inspired by Windbreaker, and came with a Creon version of the businessman GB Blackrock. Karzap's bio, included with his figure, as well as issue 9 of Transformers Timelines, A Common Foe, released the previous year, revealed that he was created as part of the G2 project within the BlackRock Corporation's Blocktown unit, as a homage to the cancelled toy line that he was originally part of. Being created in Japan meant that Karzap held a deep affinity for the country's culture, particularly car races at the Daya Speedway, even if this led to his higher fuel consumption. Unfortunately, Karzap's only fictional appearances so far have been the aforementioned issue, which presented him as a member of the Autobot Alpha Squad during the Machine Wars, and as a playable character in Transformers Battle Tactics. However, a Transformers animated incarnation of him was mentioned in the 2010 guidebook The Allspark Almanac 2, which described him as a fickle Decepticon, who had once been an Autobot. Next, we have another two-way tie on this list, Hauler and Gravedigger. I decided to merge these two characters into the same slot because they were both retconned to be the identities of the two extra Constructicons seen in the flashback to Megatron's construction in the Generation 1 cartoon episode 5 Faces of Darkness, Part 4. Hauler definitely has the more interesting story of the two, so let's begin with him. Originally, Hasbro planned to release the toy that would eventually become Grapple, the Mitsubishi Fuso crane truck from Diaclone, as part of the 1984 range of figures as Hauler. However, due to unknown reasons, the figure was held back for the 1985 range, where it was later released as the Autobot Architect Grapple instead. However, Hauler still managed to make an appearance in the Generation 1 cartoon, indicating that this was a last-minute decision. Hauler's only appearance in the show was in one scene of the show's pilot episode, More Than Meets the Eye, Part 1, where he helped Ratchet and Cliffjumper to hoist Hound up from a ravine. Hauler had no speaking lines or transformation sequences, and instantly disappeared from the show. However, in 2003, Hauler would receive his first ever figure, as part of eHobby's Collector's Edition series of Redecos, where he, sold under the name Road Hauler, was released in a 2-pack with his fellow cartoon cameo Sunstorm. Of course, Road Hauler was a redeco of Grapple, but recolored in the green and purple color scheme of the Constructicons. This led to the retcon that Hauler was one of the additional Constructicons, with the figure's bio explaining that Hauler joined up with the Autobots after his teammates were reprogrammed into Megatron's service. His bio also explained his disappearance from the show by revealing that, after rescuing Hound, he traveled all across the Earth in search of energy resources, while his conflicting color schemes were explained to to be the result of his indecisive personality. Moving on to Gravedigger, he was also the result of an outdated guideline. Originally, Gravedigger was a working name for the Constructicons leader Scrapper. Evidently, his name was finalized at the last minute, since one mistaken use of the name Gravedigger remained in the Choose Your Own Adventure book Dinobots Strike Back. During a scenario where the Constructicons disassemble Skids and Bumblebee, and use their remains to construct the Autobot Memorial Power Plant in an attempt to disguise the error, the scenario's illustration depicted Long Haul instead of Scrapper, which encouraged fans to theorize that Gravedigger was actually his own character within the story, instead of merely an error. In 2012, this idea was canonized in the United EX toy line, the Japanese counterpart to the Power Core Combiners toy line, which was previously released in America in 2010. United EX saw the release of the first ever figure of Gravedigger, albeit sold under the name Buildmaster, as a redeco of Power Core Combiners STEM Emma, rendered in the Constructicons green and purple color scheme. United EX Buildmaster transformed into a bulldozer and could merge with 4 construction-themed drones to form a super mode. The figure's story chapter, titled Unearthed Future, revealed that Gravedigger was, in fact, the younger brother of Bone Crusher, and that his unstable temper had resulted in him being left out of a majority of the Constructicons projects, save for excavation projects. By the time of United EX, set in the future of 2035, Gravedigger had joined up with the Master Chaos subgroup, one of several Decepticon subgroups controlled by the mysterious High Regent Scrush, where he was upgraded into Buildmaster. In addition to confirming his status as the 8th Constructicon, United EX also revealed that Gravedigger aimed to restore his brother, following the Constructicons' deadly encounter with Diabolus in Transformers Zone. Unfortunately, this plot point has yet to be resolved, since Gravedigger has never been featured in any other Transformers media to date. Similarly, Hauler has been largely neglected as well, even though he has managed to make a few minor appearances in fun publications media, such as the Wings Universe multi-part story Battle Lines, in which he helped to defeat his former friend's combined form of Devastator, and the Beast Wars Uprising story The Inexorable March, in which his future self, Road Hauler, became part of Buckethead's team of Micromaster Constructicons, forming the left arm of the team's version of Devastator. Also, neither Hauler nor Gravedigger have received any more figures since their initial debuts, the former case being especially baffling, since there have been multiple new grapple figures released in the last decade. Moving on to the first Beast Wars character of this list, the next obscure character is Insecticon. Bizarrely, Hasbro decided to use the name of a subgroup for an individual character, and this would not even be the last time that they would do this. Due to CGI being a very expensive animation medium in the late 1990s, a large majority of the Beast Wars toy line was absent from the show, including Insecticon, who transformed into a stag beetle. As a result, a majority of these characters have fallen into deep obscurity. However, the reason why I have singled out Insecticon among them is because he was actually considered for inclusion in the Beast Wars cartoon. He was originally planned to be introduced in the Season 1 episode Power Surge, the episode where Terrorsaur becomes powered up on Energon and briefly usurps command of the Predacons from Megatron. However, Insecticon was eventually cut from the episode's script during production, with most of his intended lines being transferred to Waspinator.
Well, what? If you're second in command, what is your command?
While Insecticon's toys bio revealed little of his personality, his extended bio from the Beast Wars sourcebook revealed that he was an obsessive and opportunistic surveillance officer, who would torture his victims by showing them visual feeds of their comrades being injured. So far, Insecticon's only appearances have been background roles in the IDW Beast Wars continuity, where he was one of the reprogrammed Maximal Protoforms under the command of Magmatron, and the 2005 IDW continuity, where his design was used for several generics among Onyx Prime's army of Maximals. The next obscure character on this list is Artfire, yet another character whose creation I will need to describe the context behind. In 1987, Hasbro released the Target Masters Transformers, whose guns were formed by smaller minifigures. In addition to creating 6 completely new figures, Point Blank, Crosshairs, Sure Shot, Slug Slinger, Misfire, and Trigger Happy, Hasbro also re-released 5 previous figures from the 1986 range: Hot Rod, Cup, Blur, Cyclonus, and Scourge, with new Target Master partners. However, when Takara released the Target Masters in Japan the same year, as part of the Headmasters toy line, they did not include the re-released Target Masters. Instead, they created 2 new Autobots by redecoing previous figures. Jazz was redecoed to create Stepper, while Inferno was redecoed to create Artfire. While both characters are fairly obscure, Stepper has received much more attention than Artfire, including a few appearances in Hasbro media, under his more recognized name Ricochet. As a result, he is on the list of characters that I plan to make history videos on in the future, so I will focus exclusively on Artfire for this segment. Transforming into a Mitsubishi Fuso fire engine, Artfire was described by his toy's bio as a patient sniper, who is often prone to putting his companions before important orders. Although Scourge's Target Master reissue was never released in Japan, his Target Master partner, Fracas, was released with Artfire, albeit given the name of Cyclonus's Target Master partner, Nightstick. Unfortunately, neither Artfire nor Ricochet featured in the Headmasters anime. However, they did appear in issue 7 of the manga, where they helped Chrome Dome to fight both the Fire and the Decepticon Target Masters, since Ricochet and Artfire were absent from the anime, and, as a result, the plasma energy explosion that had upgraded the other Target Masters, no explanation was offered as to how they became Target Masters. While Ricochet would eventually receive an explanation in his extended bio, included with his 2004 reissue, there still has yet to be an explanation for Artfire. In fact, Artfire has had only 2 minor media appearances since the Headmasters. The first was the Transformers United comic story The Fierce Fighting on Planet Nebulos, included with Volume 2 of Transformers Generations 2011, which saw a group of Autobots, including Artfire and led by Ricochet, venture to Nebulos to secure an antidote for a deadly nanovirus that had infected all of the Earthbound Autobots who were not bonded to Nebulan partners. Artfire's second appearance was the Beast Wars Uprising prologue story A Brush with Infamy, in which a flashback to the war on Nebulos revealed that his Target Master partner, actually named Fracas in this continuity, had brought Target Master technology to the Decepticons, only to be turned back over to Artfire for extradition. It is unclear as to what Fracas's punishment was. However, the mention of a hologram of him in Krunix's bar implies that he was ultimately executed. Concerning toys, Artfire has never seen a release in Hasbro's markets in any form, whether that be a reissue or a completely new figure. In fact, according to former Hasbro designer Aaron Archer, Artfire was on the shortlist for potential reissues, had the commemorative series returned after 2004. However, he did manage to receive 2 figures from Takara during the 2010s. The first was released in 2012, as part of the Transformers United toy line, a Japanese toy line that merges Hasbro's Classics Universe, Transformers 2010, and Generations toy lines into one. This toy line's version of Artfire, a redeco of Universe Inferno, was only available through a mail-away order, available through Volume 1 of Transformers Generations 2012. In addition to a new version of Nightstick, a redeco of his Universe figure, the figure also came with a second Target Master partner, Sparks. a redeco of Power Core Combiners Pinpoint. Artfire's second and most recent figure, released in 2017, was his masterpiece figure, labeled as MP37. Funnily enough, this collector-targeted figure actually costs less than Artfire's original figure on the secondary market. The figure was a redeco of Masterpiece Inferno and, of course, came with a new version of Nightstick. The release of a new Inferno figure as part of the War for Cybertron Kingdom toy line suggests the possibility of it being redecoed into Artfire as part of the Generations Select toy line. However, that has yet to be seen. The next obscure character on this list is Macabre, created for the Marvel UK comics in 1986. Macabre first appeared in the epilogue of the multi-issue story Target, 2006, in which he was a member of the 10 Deadliest Killers, a group of Decepticons that included the Triple Changers, Insecticons, and Coneheads. Of course, since there are only 3 members of each subgroup, an extra character needed to be created in order to increase the group's membership to 10, which resulted in the creation of Macabre, who has a slightly similar design to Scourge. Concerning Macabre's personality, he was depicted as a small-time thug who idolized the Triple Changer Octane, and wished to be seen as an equal by him and the rest of the 10 Deadliest Killers, hence his desire to kill the Autobot Emirate Xaran. At the end of Target, 2006, the 10 Deadliest Killers, including Macabre, assembled to ambush Xaran at the Imperial Amphitheater. However, unknowingly to them, this was a trap set up as part of Operation Volcano, a plan by the Wreckers, an Autobot commando unit, to lure out and assassinate the Decepticons. Fortunately for the Decepticons, they were prevented from walking into the trap when Megatron requested that the Coneheads and Insecticons be sent to Earth via the space bridge. Driven by his desire for recognition, Macabre continued with the mission and attempted to gun down Xaran, only for the fatal blast to be taken by the Wreckers' leader, Impactor. After a frustrated rant, Macabre attempted to fire a second shot, only for the other Wreckers to shoot him to pieces, presumably killing him. Although Macabre never transformed in the issue, his alternate mode was confirmed to be an air glider, through the letters column Grimgrams. Unfortunately, Macabre has never received an official figure, mainly due to being an original creation for the comics without any representation in the original toy line. Concerning his appearances in later media, he was featured in several flashbacks within the 2010 IDW miniseries Last Stand of the Wreckers. In the 2005 IDW continuity, Macabre was depicted as the leader of Squadron X, a Decepticon equivalent to the Wreckers. Succeeding former Wrecker Valve as leader of the group, Macabre collected the insignias of high-ranking Autobots who he killed and wore them on a chain around his neck. However, after a battle on the planet Bova, the members of Squadron X, including Macabre, were eventually taken into custody by the Wreckers. Even though the Wreckers were ordered to release their captives, Impactor ultimately chose to execute them personally, while they were still restrained, which in turn led to his own incarceration on Garrus 9. Macabre's final and most recent appearance has been the Wings Universe Prose story Tornado, Decepticon Saboteur, where he was once again depicted as the leader of Squadron X, although he proved unpopular with other Decepticons, due to his obsessive rivalry with the Wreckers. Ultimately, when he refused to alter his plans against the Wreckers, Macabre was killed when his teammate Earthquake ran towards him with several bombs strapped to his chest. Interestingly, following his death, Macabre was considered by Squadron X member Tornado to possess Megatron's strength, Shockwave's firepower, and 3 times Galvatron's insanity. Next, we have another two-way tie on this list, Blackout and Sandstorm. If you are familiar with the Movieverse Decepticon Helicopter and the Generation 1 Autobot Triple Changer, then you may be confused as to why I am displaying random seekers with these names. That will require an interesting explanation. Since Generation 2 experienced fairly poor sales, several planned toys were ultimately cancelled. Among them were 2 new seekers, Blackout and Sandstorm. Blackout was planned to be released as a black redeco of Starscream, transforming into an F-15 Eagle jet fighter, while Sandstorm was planned to be released as a desert camouflage deco of Ramjet, transforming into a modified version of the same jet fighter. Interestingly, there were two more cancelled Seeker decos, in addition to these two. The first was a jungle camouflage deco of Starscream, while the other was a blue sky redeco of Ramjet. However, these redecos may have been cancelled fairly early, since they did not receive names, leaving it unclear if they were intended to be new characters or upgraded forms for Starscream and Ramjet respectively. Unfortunately, neither of these characters have received any major media appearances. However, Sandstorm was lucky enough to receive his first official figure in 2020, as part of the Generations Selects toy line. The figure was a redeco of Earthrise Ramjet in the cancelled figures Desert Camouflage Deco, and was sold in a 2-pack with a new version of Generation 2 Megatron. Sandstorm's new figure also led to him making a brief cameo in the issue Volcanicus Comic 3 of the Generations Selects special comic, where he was shot in the chest, and presumably killed, by Snarl's reflective spikes. On the other hand, Blackout has never received an official figure or any appearances in media, likely due to more people associating the name with the Movieverse Decepticon helicopter. So far, the closest that we have to an official figure of Generation 2 Blackout is the black redeco of the Generation 1 Starscream figure, released as part of eHobby's Collector's Edition series of redecos in 2001, in a 2-pack with his Ghost version. However, the figure was instead meant to represent the Machine Wars incarnation of Starscream, who had been released in 1997. It is unfortunate that Blackout has not received an official figure yet, especially since there have been multiple Seeker molds released in the last 2 decades, and his color scheme would be fairly easy to replicate. However, there is still a possibility of Blackout appearing in the Generations Selects toy line, as a redeco of any of the Starscream figures released in the War for Cybertron trilogy. However, if he were to appear, then I think that the Earthrise mold would be the most likely to be used. Despite his obscurity, Blackout could still have a chance of receiving a new figure, especially considering Sandstorm's inclusion and the heavy rumors that Generation 2 Ramjet will be coming to Selects in the future. The next obscure character on this list is another one of the more recent Transformers characters, Scrapface. When the War for Cybertron cartoon was first launched on Netflix, a small assortment of Siege figures were re-released with new color schemes, as Walmart exclusives, under the War for Cybertron trilogy branding, both this wave and Wave 2. The latter containing a few decos of Earthrise figures, consisted mostly of pre-existing characters, with extensive battle damage and grime decos. However, Wave 1 did contain one new character, as well as the only new character to feature in the Netflix toy line so far, Scrapface. Labeled as WFC-05, Scrapface was a redeco of Siege Refractor, transforming into an artillery hovercraft, as well as 1/3 of the reflector camera, and was described by his product description as a refractor clone who was desperate to fight Autobots on the front lines. Presumably by coincidence, Scrapface's blue, red and grey color scheme resembles an animation error in the Generation 1 episode More Than Meets the Eye, Part 2, where one of the 3 reflectors is mistakenly colored like Starscream. Despite his figure being released in Wave 1 of the Netflix toy line, Scrapface would not actually appear in the show until its second chapter, Earthrise. Voiced by actor Adin Rudd, Scrapface was introduced as a low-ranking Decepticon trooper, who was selected to have his spark harvested for Energon to power the Nemesis. Luckily though, he and several other Decepticons were rescued by Elita 1's team of Autobots. Scrapface would later return the favor when he rescued Elita's team from the same fate that he would have suffered. Following their escape, Scrapface and a group of fellow renegade Decepticons would assist Elita's team with a plan to blow up the Kaon Arena. Unfortunately, neither group was able to escape the powerful explosion in time, leaving Scrapface's fate ambiguous. The only other appearance of Scrapface's design so far has been the issue Abominus Comic 2 of the Generations Selects special comic. However, rather than a Generation 1 cartoon version of Scrapface, his design was instead used to represent this continuity's version of Reflector, after being corrupted by Angelmu Energy, the lifeblood of Unicron. Next, we have the only obscure character on this list who does not originate from a Generation 1 themed continuity, Thundertron. He was introduced in the Transformers Prime toy line in 2012, where he was designed as a peg-legged pirate, who transformed into a robotic lion. In terms of media, he was introduced in the 2011 novel Transformers Exiles and later appeared in the 2014 novel Transformers Retribution, with the latter novel revealing his origins. During the golden age of Cybertron, Thundertron was a native of one of Cybertron's colony planets, until the Cybertronian Empire retreated back to Cybertron, leaving the inhabitants of Thundertron's homeworld to die during the outbreak of cosmic crust. However, several inhabitants were able to survive, with them later being organized into the unaligned Starseekers, with Thundertron as their leader and captain of their spacecraft, the Tidal Wave. The abandonment of his people and destruction of his home world had left Thundertron with an unquenchable hatred of the Cybertronian race, and an obsessive desire for their eradication, loosely inspired by the character of Captain Ahab from the 1851 novel Moby Dick. During the Starseekers' search for Cybertron, they came into contact with Velocitron, one of Cybertron's colonies, and Junkion, a planetoid of trash. During their visit to the latter planetoid, Thundertron forced the native Junkions to attach a space bridge to the Tidal Wave, so that they could pursue the Autobots and Decepticons. Thundertron would later duel with Megatron on an asteroid after failing to destroy the Nemesis with the Requiem Blaster, but would eventually retreat. The Starseekers plotline in these novels was originally intended to be a setup for the third season of the Transformers Prime cartoon. However, this was eventually dropped in favor of the Beast Hunters arc. The Starseekers were later considered again for the planned fourth season, but the show was ultimately cancelled after Predacons Rising, leaving the story of Thundertron's hatred for the Cybertronian race unresolved. The Starseekers were also planned to appear in the 2012 online game Transformers Online, but the game itself was ultimately cancelled. While the Starseeker faction itself was featured in issue 10 of Transformers Timelines, Hoist the Flag, Thundertron himself was absent, with the group's captain instead being Cannonball the Fifth. Next, we actually have the only three-way tie to appear on this list. The Autobot Power Dashers Groma, Zeta, and Aragon. Released in 1984, the Power Dashers were only available through mail-away orders included with normal retail figures. After sending an order, customers would be mailed one of three different motorized figures that transformed into Cybertronian vehicles. The most commonly shipped variant transformed into a jet, while the other two variants transformed into a drill tank and a Formula One race car respectively. Unfortunately, none of the Power Dashers were named or given personalities in any of the stories included on flyers, nor did they appear in the original cartoon or the Marvel Comics. However, they are notable for being the first ever official Transformers figures with Cybertronian alternate modes, since Shockwave was released the next year, 1985. The Power Dashers did manage to receive some minor characterization when all three of them shared a profile in issue 4 of Dreamwave's More Than Meets the Eye series of profile books. Unfortunately, they still did not receive individual names, and their profile described the group as a whole, rather than each member individually. The Power Dashers were described as cheerfully helpful Earthbound Autobots, who were designed after ancient Cybertronians. Due to their recent creation, the Power Dashers were unaware of the full extent of their abilities and were still maturing. The Power Dashers also made background cameos in Volume 3, Issue 2 of Dreamwave's Transformers, Generation 1 comic series, where they helped to repair the Orion after awakening from stasis. The Jet-type Power Dasher would eventually receive a name, when they and the Drill-type appeared in issue 10 of IDW's 2012 comic series More Than Meets the Eye. In the issue, The Gloaming, a flashback to a battle on the planet Clemency depicted the Power Dashers as part of a crew of Autobots led by Ultra Magnus, whose order for the team to disable the Nightmare engine confirmed the name of the Jet-type Power Dasher, Chroma. Meanwhile, the Drill and Car-type Power Dashers would receive their names from Ask Vector Prime in 2015, which named the Drill-type Zeta and the Car-type Aragon. Just a few years after this, all three Power Dashers received new figures as part of the War for Cybertron Siege toy line, as redecos and retools of the line's three weaponizers 6-gun, front, and cog, listed in the same order as the Power Dashers, and could transform into weapons for other figures. While Chroma and Zeta shared the same alternate modes as their previous appearances, Aragon now transformed into an armored vehicle rather than a Formula 1 race car. Also, while Chroma and Zeta were released through Generations Selects, Aragon was released as part of an Amazon-exclusive 3-pack with Holo Mirage and Decepticon Impactor. While the Power Dashers have not yet featured in either the rebooted IDW comics or Netflix's War for Cybertron cartoon, they have made brief cameos within the Generations Selects special comic as background Autobots, which means that they still have yet to receive individual personalities of their own. Currently, Zeta is the only member to receive an alternate incarnation, that being an evil version of him from Shattered Glass, who, along with Skyfall, was likely executed for treachery. Next, we have quite possibly the shortest entry on this list, as the next obscure character is Modulus. So far, Modulus has yet to even appear in fiction, as the only mention of him in any form is a hypothetical combination, mentioned in the instructions for Combiner Wars Shattered Glass Starscream. According to the instructions, Modulus is formed by Scattershot, Rook, Medics, Generation 2 Ratchet, and Shattered Glass Starscream. Unfortunately, not a lot of people will be able to form him, since only 2 of his components are available at mass retail, with 2 more being exclusive to the customization class held at BotCon 2016, and the final member being the 7th bonus figure for the Transformers Figure Subscription Service 5.0. Since Betatron is another combiner that involves random limbs merging with Scattershot, it can be inferred that Modulus is merely a specific variant of Betatron. So far, Modulus has not yet appeared in fiction in any form, and, unfortunately, it seems very unlikely that he ever will, partly due to his obscurity, and partly because 2 of his components are from alternate universes. Next, we have another obscure seeker, Red Wing. Interestingly, Red Wing owes his entire existence to a series of complicated miscommunications between Hasbro, Takara, Fun Publications, and eHobby, which began with planning for BotCon 2013's exclusive figures. Fun Publications' original plan for BotCon 2013 was to release a souvenir 3-pack of redecos of the classic Starscream mold, in the colors of the group of Seekers that appeared in the Generation 1 cartoon's first episode, More Than Meets the Eye, Part 1. As the result of an animation error, however, at the time of planning for BotCon 2013, Fun Publications had entered a deal with eHobby, the company responsible for naming the Orange Seeker Sunstorm and turning him into an actual character. Since eHobby, at the time, had plans to release their own Sunstorm redeco of classics Starscream, Fun Publications decided to remove him from the 3-pack and replace him with a new character named Hotlink, a name that would eventually be applied to the Purple Seeker with a flamethrower, who was planned to be named Nacelle. Originally, Hotlink was planned to have an orange-red color scheme, and both Sunstorm and the planned version of Hotlink were set to appear in issue 8 of Transformers Timeline's Termination. However, eHobby's Sunstorm figure was eventually cancelled, since they were informed by Takara that Hasbro had plans to release their own Sunstorm figure, likely referring to the masterpiece Sunstorm figure that was released in late 2012. 2012. As a result of these changes, Fun Publications eventually decided to re-include Sunstorm in the 3-pack, as well as reassigning the name Hotlink to the Purple Seeker, with the name Nacelle being applied to a completely different Seeker in 2015. However, due to these last-minute rearrangements, Termination still featured the scrapped Orange-Red Seeker, who appeared as part of a joint Autobot and Decepticon assault on the Cybertronian clone army, only to be shot in the back and presumably killed by a clone of Skywarp. Interestingly though, the Seeker actually appeared to be fully red, due to the lighting effects and contrast with the background within the final printed comic. Following 2013, Fun Publications were persistently questioned about the identity of the mysterious Red Seeker, with the character eventually being named Red Wing. Briefly following this, Red Wing was given some slight characterization by Transformers Legends, when he featured in the game's Golden Age event in 2013, in which he participated in an unsuccessful attempt to prevent the recreation of Optimus Prime. His cards described him as a skilled gunner with a devil-may-care attitude. In 2016, Red Wing even made a brief cameo in issue 50 of IDW's comic series The Transformers, Volume 2. In the issue, Once Upon a Time on Earth, Red Wing could be briefly sighted among the Decepticons present at Galvatron's attempted assault on Shanghai, and he was later name-dropped by Skywarp in issue 5 of Unicron Assembly. All of these minor appearances built up to the eventual release of Red Wing's first ever figure in 2019, as part of the Generations Selects toy line. As a redeco of Siege Starscream, Red Wing transformed into a Cybertronian Tetrajet. Unfortunately, none of the generic Seekers featured in Netflix's War for Cybertron cartoon have used his color scheme yet. However, there were several Red Seekers present during the 2 Cybertron scenes of the Bumblebee film in 2018, many of which could be considered to be Red Wing. Additionally, since the Transformers Cyberverse incarnation of Thrust does not feature a cone head, a staple design element of incarnations of Thrust, the character was actually renamed Red Wing for the show's Japanese dub. However, the details on him, or her, in the Japanese dub, will have to wait for our history video on Thrust. Next, we have another obscure character who people may recognize from their appearance in the War for Cybertron trilogy, Lifeline. While Lifeline herself is a relatively new character, her origins actually date back to 1986, with the Generation 1 cartoon Season 3 episode Fight or Flee. In the episode, Cyclonus and Scourge were heavily injured during a space battle and crash-landed on Paradron, a Cybertronian colony planet inhabited by pacifist Autobots. Upon being recovered by the planet's natives, the Decepticons were nursed back to health by a pair of the planet's medics, who were simply greenery colors of RC's model. Throughout Transformers history, the cartoon's depiction of the Paradron medics, as nameless, identical, greenery colors of RC, has carried over into their few other appearances, such as Devil Juice G.I. Joe vs. the Transformers miniseries and the Wings Universe multi-part story battle lines. A figure of a Paradron medic was planned for the Binaltech toy line in 2008, as a redeco of Binaltech RC, but was unfortunately cancelled. Meanwhile, the green and white color scheme of the Paradron medics would be used for the aerial Paradron type redeco of Energon RC in 2004. However, this figure instead represented an alternate version of RC. However, the first official figure of a Paradron medic, named Lifeline, was finally released in 2017, as part of the Transformers figure subscription service 5.0. Lifeline was a redeco of Generations Thrilling 30 RC, transforming into a Cybertronian car, and came with a Target Master partner named Quickslinger. The figure's bio as well as the extended bio included in issue 68 of the Transformers Collectors Club magazine, revealed that Lifeline was the last surviving member of the Paradron Medics Corporation, and a pacifist who felt uncomfortable with treating wounded soldiers, with the knowledge that they would be injured in battle again. Lifeline was featured in the multi-part story of Masters and Mayhem, an alternate universe where a majority of the Cybertronian race had been wiped out by the Mayhem attack squad's combined form of Thunder Mayhem. After discovering the critically injured Punch, the Wreckers' leader Impactor brought him to Paradron, where he was put into Lifeline's care. Ultimately, Lifeline was able to save Punch by confining him to his second robot mode, Counterpunch. Lifeline was also name-dropped in the Beast Wars Uprising story Not All Megatrons, where she was regarded as a war hero and was memorialized by the Lifeline Memorial Hospital in Stanix. Lifeline's most recent figure was released in 2020, as part of the War for Cybertron, Earthrise toy line. Released as part of the Amazon-exclusive Paradron Medics 2-pack with Ratchet, as part of the Galactic Odyssey Collection subline, Lifeline was a redeco of Earthrise RC, which came with the unfortunate consequence of the figure being an extreme shell former and parts former. The product description for the figures revealed that, after arriving on Paradron to retrieve a large sum of energon, Ratchet encountered the medic Lifeline, who had fled to the planet after the outbreak of the war. After Ratchet proved his medical skills and dedication by repairing the injured hothouse, the pair decided to merge their talents and form the Paradron Medics team. Unfortunately, this has not been depicted in any media yet. Returning to Beast Wars, the next obscure character on this list is Onyx Primal, not to be confused with Onyx Prime. Even though fellow BotCon Beast Wars characters Packrat and Fractal were considered for, but ultimately did not make it onto this list, Onyx Primal has managed to remain on it, since he is much more obscure and has a more interesting background. Onyx Primal's original figure, only available to attendees of BotCon 1996, was a black redeco of Optimus Primal's vampire bat figure, hence the similar names. A special variant of the figure was made available to dealers at the convention, which was the same figure but with the phrase BotCon 96 dealer exclusive tampographed onto the back in metallic gold paint. The more interesting aspect of Onyx Primal's history is the state of flux surrounding his factional loyalties. His original 1996 bio labeled him as a Predacon assassin, with the rest of his description, interestingly, being a rewording of a quote from the 1994 film Pulp Fiction. However, due to his figure being a redeco of a Maximal mold, Hasbro retroactively declared that Onyx was actually a Maximal, which led to an extended bio for him being uploaded to BotCon Online. This extended bio revealed that Onyx Primal was originally an assassin for the Tripredacus Council. However, an unspecified incident led to Onyx defecting to the Maximals, a decision that neither he nor his new compatriots were thrilled with. Onyx's stubborn need to assert his superiority resulted in him becoming unpopular with the other Maximals, but he remained with them out of fear of his former employers. Onyx was subsequently depicted as a Maximal in the BotCon Beast Wars story Visitations, with him being voiced by Optimus Primal's voice actor Gary Chalk for the live reading at BotCon 1998. The story saw Onyx and Packrat battle the Predacons Fractal and Vice Grip over a mysterious artifact, before it was stolen by a shadowy figure, setting up later BotCon stories. Confusingly, the Beast Wars sourcebook chose to once again depict Onyx Primal as a Predacon assassin, who operated during the night. In 2016, Onyx was once again depicted as a Predacon in the Beast Wars Uprising story Trigger Warnings, in which he was a member of the Predacon Secret Police. Initially, he aided Wolfang's investigation into the murder of the target Master World, only to turn on him when fellow agent Tarantulas managed to convince him that Wolfang was sheltering the true killer, another target master named Overrun, which resulted in the deaths of both Overrun and Wolfang, in order to keep Target Master technology out of the wrong hands. So far, Onyx Primal's most recent appearance, in 2017, has been a cameo in issue 9 of Optimus Prime, The Life of Sideswipe, as part of a final dream offered to a dying Sideswipe. A group of Decepticons, including Onyx Primal, assisted with relief efforts on a post-war Cybertron, only to momentarily be mistaken for Energon smugglers by Sideswipe. Unfortunately, Onyx Primal has not received any new figures since his BotCon release, even though there was an opportunity for that to happen when Titan's Return Mindwipe was redecoed to create a new version of Optimus Primal's bat form, named Converbat, in 2016 as an eHobby exclusive. But alas, Onyx Primal continues to dwell in deep, dark obscurity. Next, we have a character who was part of the original draft for this list, but was removed at one point during production, only to be added back into the finished draft, and that character is Megaplex. While Megaplex is definitely one of the more interesting characters on this list, he unfortunately does not have enough appearances to justify his own history video, hence why he has made his way back onto this list. Megaplex's original figure was released during the short-lived Machine Wars toy line in 1997, which was exclusive to KB Toys, using a previously cancelled mold that had been planned for Generation 2. Megaplex transformed into a Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor fighter jet, a mold that he shared with the Machine Wars version of Megatron, which leads to the more interesting aspect of this character. Megaplex's bio revealed that he was one of several clones of the Decepticon leader created to serve as decoys to confuse Autobots. Unfortunately, there was no accompanying Machine Wars fiction at the time, so Megaplex's interesting concept went undeveloped for years. However, it would receive some slight development when a new figure of him was released in 2003. As part of eHobby's Collector's Edition series of redecos. Fitting Megaplex's clone origins, the figure was a redeco of the Generation 1 Megatron figure, transforming into his iconic alternate mode, a Waller P-38 pistol, and even came with a version of Megatron's Energon flail, now colored yellow. The figure's bio contained most of the same information as the original, but now revealed that Megatron had intentionally restricted Megaplex's abilities, as to not match his own. Megaplex's third, and most recent, figure was released at BotCon 2013. As part of the convention's Machine Wars event, the figure was a redeco of Prime, Robots in Disguise Dreadwing, transforming into a Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, evoking his original form. Rather than a Decepticon, this version of Megaplex was part of G-Axius' faction of second-generation Cybertronians, the story of which was told in the first-ever pieces of Machine Wars fiction. Issues 8 and 9 of Transformers Timelines, Termination and A Common Foe. As revealed in these issues, along with Megaplex's bio included with both his figure and issue 9, G-Axius decided to create a clone army of the most effective warriors in Cybertronian history, as part of his plan to wipe out the first generation of Cybertronians. Reluctantly, G-Axius also decided to clone Megatron, due to him being a successful conqueror, which resulted in the creation of Megaplex. Despite G-Axius' attempts to eradicate it, Megatron's original personality remained active within Megaplex's mind, eventually resurfacing during the clone army's initial siege of Cybertron. After being taunted by the Autobot General Obsidian, Megaplex began to embrace the original Megatron's megalomaniacal personality, which led to G-Axius promising to terminate him. Following a mental battle with the manifestation of Megatron within his mind, Megaplex eventually managed to overpower and destroy his progenitor, who shared a similar design to him, referencing their Machine Wars roots. Now free of his split consciousness, Megaplex enacted his revenge upon G-Axius by impaling him through the chest. Megaplex was last seen being restrained by the Decepticon Bravo team, who dismissed his desire for a Decepticon-controlled Cybertron. Since Megaplex was not seen again after the signing of the Pax Cybertronia, it can be inferred that he was either imprisoned or executed. Megaplex's most recent appearance, in 2020, has been a brief cameo in issue 20 of the rebooted IDW continuity, Swindles, in which he was part of a crowd that attended a skitter race at Swindles. Megaplex's design was a virtual redeco of Energon Starscream, and he could even be seen next to a version of Machine Wars Starscream. Unfortunately, it does not seem that Megaplex will have a major role in the comic, which is honestly a shame, since he is an interesting concept with a lot of potential. The second to last obscure character on this list is Halonix Maximus. Created for the Generation 1 cartoon in 1984, Halonix Maximus only appeared at the end of the Season 1 finale Heavy Metal War, where Hound used a hologram of a giant Autobot to distract the Decepticons, so that Optimus Prime could neutralize Devastator.
Nothing defeats the Devastator. Nothing. Nothing, little one. What would you say about me? The giant Autobot was a holographic illusion. It wasn't real.
Voiced by Optimus Prime and Ironhide's voice actor Peter Cullen, the hologram was only credited as Giant Autobot in the episode's script, and it was not made clear if this was just a design that Hound had made up on the spot to intimidate the Decepticons or if he was actually projecting the visage of a legendary Autobot. However, the Giant Autobot would eventually be turned into his own character and named Halonix Maximus when he was featured in the Wings Universe multi-part story The Coming Storm. In this story, set millions of years before the Generation 1 cartoon, Halonix was a member of the Autobot Elite Guard, serving as leader of its artillery team. Although Halonix did not receive his own bio in any issues, he did receive a brief description on the Transformers Collectors Club forums, which revealed that he suffered from an extreme superiority complex. After he had carpet-bombed a group of Decepticons, most of the Elite Guard gave Halonix the nickname Gigantron. Unfortunately, most of the Elite Guard were killed by the treacherous Combaticons in their combined form of Bruticus, including Halonix Maximus. While Halonix has yet to receive an official figure, he did make a brief cameo, in 2020, in issue 25 of the rebooted IDW continuity, Warworld Prime. After receiving the Matrix of Leadership, Optimus Prime began to experience events from Cybertronian history, including a battle between Halonix and Predatron, while a statue within the Senate building depicted a battle between him and Zarak Maximus, who had previously assisted him with rescuing Solomus from Turbo Foxes. The 20th and final obscure character on this list is Blue Bacchus, who is a fairly similar case to Artfire. As part of the Transformers Victory toy line in 1989, two of the Mega Pretenders that were released in Hasbro's markets the same year were redecoed and retooled to create the Decepticon Crossformers, a pair of rogue space gangsters who were loyal only to the highest bidder. Thunderwing was redecoed to create Black Shadow, while Crossblades was redecoed to create Blue Bacchus. In a similar case to Ricochet and Artfire, while both of the Crossformers are fairly obscure, Black Shadow has just enough appearances to justify his own video, so I will now focus exclusively on Blue Bacchus. Being able to merge with his pretender Shelterformer Cybertronian helicopter, Blue Bacchus was described by his bio as a cold-hearted and merciless gunman, who was like a younger sibling to his partner in crime Black Shadow, despite Black Shadow being willing to kill him if need be, due to the large bounty placed on the pair's heads. Appearing in only one episode of the Victory anime, Planet Micro, the mysterious warrior, the Crossformers were hired by Hellbat to assist him with an Energon raid on the planet Micro, with the promise of a high fee. However, the pair were confronted by their former partner in crime Greatshot, who joined Star Saber's Autobots. Ultimately, the raid ended in failure when Hellbat's Energon was destroyed, along with the Crossformers' outer shells, forcing them to escape in their smaller robot modes. Unfortunately, neither of the Crossformers appeared in any further Japanese media, leaving their fates ambiguous. Even though Blue Bacchus has never received any new figures since Victory, he has made a few brief cameos in various comics. First of all, he appeared in issue 9 of Transformers Timelines, A Common Foe, as part of the Decepticon forces that fought against G-Axis' invasion of Cybertron, with his design being a virtual raid echo of Transformers 2010, Tomahawk. Next, he appeared in issue 54 of More Than Meets the Eye, Rage, as part of Deathsaurus' Decepticons, and could briefly be seen advancing on Rodimus. Unfortunately, this scene was never followed up on. However, Rodimus' survival implies that Blue Bacchus was either killed or forced to flee. Finally, an alternate version of Blue Bacchus appeared in the issue Super Megatron Comic 3 of the Generations Selects special comic, as part of the Blue Order of the Primus Vanguard. However, since the Blue Order later tore itself apart, thanks to the meddling of Straxus, it is most likely that Blue Bacchus was eventually killed by another member of the Order. That is quite a grim way to end this list. And there you have it. Those were 20 plus of the most obscure Transformers characters. The reason why I have restarted my Transformers videos with an analysis of several obscure characters is because I have plans to make history videos on Transformers characters and concepts. And this video was made to cover characters who I do not think have enough history to justify their own videos. Of course, there are a plethora of obscure characters that I did not cover, including Zarak Maximus, Black Rorichi, Galva Convoy, Magnus Prime, etc. Hopefully, I might make a second video sometime in the future and cover some more obscure characters. Like I mentioned in a community post and at the beginning of this video, this does not mark an end to my Five Nights at Freddy's content, as I have plenty of ideas for videos on it in the future, since it is one of my favorite media franchises. I will not go into too much detail with this, since I have already discussed my thoughts in a community post. However, if you were unfamiliar with Transformers before watching this video, then hopefully this video may have interested you somewhat in this franchise. I would like to thank you for watching my first attempt at a purely informative video, and I apologize if my first attempt has been somewhat clunky. With all of my points addressed, that will be all for this video. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section, and please subscribe to my channel if you would like to stay up to date with my newest uploads. Thank you for watching.